Hey everybody, this is Ask Primal, and my shirt is officially cooler than yours. The main thing I think about when I go in character as a storyteller is making sure that my actions are having the appropriate effect. One thing it's hard to comprehend unless you've run a game is how far reaching everything that you do is. And you have to take into consideration that whatever you say is absolute canon. It's very hard for players to bring themselves to mistrust what a storyteller is telling them, especially the lead storyteller of a game. They, even if the character is in opposition to their character, they still almost treat them like mentors because they're trying to take cues from the people that are running the game. So it really, main thing I think about is what I'm trying to accomplish with this character, but also I'm really trying to create an entertaining and engaging scene, because if you create engaging scenes, that inspires other people to create engaging scenes. So um, mainly when I go in character, while you guys are trying to entertain yourselves, and I'm sure some of you are trying to entertain others, I'm absolutely there to somehow help the game or help someone have some sort of fun. It's really interesting that you say regardless of outside experience, because often the people who have the most trouble getting involved in our games is the ones who come in to storyteller chambers for the first time and act like they have something to teach us. I mean, if I had $1 for every single time we had a player show up and they were talking about had they been a storyteller for 7 years and all that, that really doesn't mean much to us. While you might have played the game before and you might have run the game before and all these other sorts of things, you haven't run our game. You haven't run it our way. And we don't exactly do Vampire by the book. And we run things our own way. So we want you to learn our way of doing Vampire. And if you come in with a lot of assumptions about how things are, you're going to run into a lot of trouble. And it leads to problems where people think that we're being assholes when in reality we are doing the right thing by our game. Now, if someone is completely new to our game, I would have them realize that there are a lot of really, really cutthroat power gaming vampire games out there, and just internet games in general. And they need to understand that we try very hard to keep the power escalation of the game low. We don't have PCs running around with uber powers looking to smack people around all the time. And the reason for that is that it's no fun for anybody, except for that one dude with Potence 5 who can kick the shit out of everything. And that one guy with Potence 5, even then he has a more boring time because he never has to worry about the consequences for his actions. If you cannot be threatened by anything short of a pack of Elder Garu, it's very hard for a plot to actually engage your character. So that power escalation is something that we very much fight against. And we often get characters that come in who try to mod up expecting for their character to get attacked almost immediately. When in reality, while we do have moments of PC on PC violence, and I fully support that, those moments should be important to the plot line. And they shouldn't be just, we're going to gack you because we can and we're bored. We'll come down on that like a ton of fucking bricks any day of the week, because that's not fair to anybody. And I've been at the other end of that, and I do not like it. So if something happens in character like that, it should be for an actual in-character solid reason, rather than just some guy being an immature dick. As for a third thing that they need to know, I think they need to know that we don't bring the crack very much. We try to run something which is understated, if that makes any sense. We don't want Bali. We don't want La Sombra Anti-Tribu. We do not want unusual things. We don't want a city full of unique little snowflakes. And I don't just mean that in the terms of the characters, which are the rare clans or whatever. I'm talking about ones with weird backgrounds, with, you know, with bizarre combinations of shit. One of the things that me and a friend of mine, Chris, were talking about recently is that people often try to create characters that are interesting by making their backgrounds interesting and unusual, or making them unusual, not necessarily interesting. And this is kind of like the guy in high school who tries to make up for not having a personality by having an iguana. We all know that guy. He's not really that interesting. He just has an iguana. It's more important to create a character whose personality is engaging and who has a reason to talk to people, has a way of interacting with them, who isn't the loner sitting in the corner of the room. But at the same time, you have to create a character who's part of the vampire universe. So he can't just be your average Joe Schmo who just hangs around and is friends with everybody. He needs to be a character within the Vampire the Masquerade scope. But he shouldn't be somebody who's trying to be, he or she shouldn't be somebody who's trying to be unique through making their background or sheet outlandish. I'll say it once, I'll say it 1,000 times. A failure is always more interesting than a success. Everybody winning is the most boring story imaginable. And the most interesting stories are ones in which even those who taste victory have some defeat upon them. So, and also, I'd rather have everyone be entertained. This game is not about you or anyone else fulfilling their power fantasies. It's about having fun and creating a character which engages people, or creating a storyline which engages people and that people have fun playing in. So a failure when everyone laughs, I mean, that's the best of both worlds. I would always say that the best stories at least begin with failure, and the most interesting stories are almost exclusively about failure. I never read just one book at once, but here's the collection I roll through during my nightly reading. My current favorite is this wonderful little title. It is The Nazis and the Occult by D. Sklar, which has a really awesome name. It was originally titled something else, but it was reprinted. I found this for $1 at Half Price Books, which is a chain of great bookstores that we have one in town, which gets far too much of my money. And this thing is about, I mean, it's great role-playing fuel in general. It's about occultism, the SS, the rise of mystical thought in Nazi Germany, how various occult beliefs and clairvoyance and dowsing and racial theory fed into the Nazi party. And is really one of the biggest responses I would have is content to anyone who repeats that stupid line about the Nazis being secular humanist atheists, because they really weren't. They had a lot of weird stuff going on inside their little fucked up racist brains. And this book is pretty short, and it goes into a decent amount of detail about Heinrich Himmler and his attempts to recreate a German order of occult knights and his obsession with magic and the weird kind of new age therapies that various Nazi people aspire to, and the belief in ghosts and all this other sorts of stuff. It's an interesting read. It's got a macabre fascination to it. I've been on a history kick lately, so the other book I picked this up at Goodwill a little while back, and I actually like it because it's a pre-2001 release. It is a concise history of the Middle East, and I'm only about this far through it. The only real problem I have with this one is that it doesn't go into much detail about early Islam. It starts at the birth of Muhammad, and I'm already into the 19th century Ottoman Empire. And he looks like he's going to spend a lot of time on the 20th century, which I can understand, where he's going to go over the 7 year the Yom Kippur War and Israel and all this sort of stuff, and that's really where his focus is. But I am fascinated with the Middle East. I've always been, as kind of the cradle of civilization. I really like Babylon and Sumeria, so I decided to read up on this gives a pretty good history of Islam, the Middle East, the relationships with Europe and India, and it's a pretty thick book for saying the concise history, but it's got a lot of ground to cover. I'm enjoying this one. I think it would be good to read. One thing that really spoke to it is I looked up on Amazon on Lark. It's got a few more editions that have been out, and conservatives hate it. I guess because it gives a lot of the Muslim viewpoint on what occurred. So yeah, the rabid neocons hate it. So I can't help but like it. A third nonfiction work I'm picking up this is another thing I got at Half Price Books. It's called Across the Board. It covers chess problems and how they mathematically relate to one another, and how to derive math problems from games. It uses chess as a model, but it's really about how to apply mathematics to rules. And it's really dry stuff if you're not into game theory and mathematics, but I think it's fascinating. The last nonfiction work I completed recently is a collection of stories called Wastelands. It's about post-apocalyptic settings. It's one of the reasons I started running the Downfall game. And it's got a really great collection of stories. Not all of them are good, but it's perhaps one of the most depressing but excellent books you've ever read, because it's a collection of short stories about the end of the world. It starts out with The End of the Whole Mess by Stephen King, which, if you haven't read the story, it's amusing as all hell. It ranges from the honestly sad to the slightly kind of macabre humor to the full-on tank girl over the topness, but it definitely leans more towards the serious. But I actually quite like it. It's a very good collection. Honestly, my problem is that I really don't watch that much television. Um, my all-time favorite TV shows are The Wire and The Prisoner, without any doubt. Lately, at work, where I catch up with most of my television on Netflix, is where I mainly get it from. I've been watching. I've actually watched Star Trek: Deep Space Nine more because I like The Next Generation, and I finished watching all of those. So I was like, "What the hell?" It reaches its stride about the fourth season, then has a really crappy ending. I've started watching a few of the old X-Files episodes, which I actually think is kind of an understated gem. That it was surprising how quickly that show found its footing and its niche. And I have to say, it's a fun show to watch, and I think that it's kind of been forgotten in the last 10 years or so, and I think it's very much worth looking at. So, my favorite TV show, I don't really watch enough of the new ones to make a big grab at it, and the ones I do watch, they're really just stuff to sit down and watch with Steph. So I watch stuff like Pawn Stars. I'll tell you one show that I absolutely despise that's on right now is that show on the Travel Channel, Hardcore Pawn. And the reason is I can't get over it's just exploitative, because it's this reality show about a pawn shop in downtown Detroit. And like every single episode, they have to have this look at the funny, angry black people moment that makes me really, really uncomfortable and makes me go, wow, that's really disgusting and exploitative because, those black people are crazy, right? We all know that, right? So yeah. So the answer to what's my favorite TV show right now, I guess, is the answer is Moo. I'm not going to answer this question simply on the basis that I don't like criticizing the work of my storytellers. They all do a bang up job. And I can't really say there are many plot lines I can look at and say, oh, that was an absolute failure. There's ones that fail to get off the ground, but if they manage to engage people, that's fine. And if I don't approve of them personally, I'm not going to voice it here because my storytellers have my full support, and I'm not going to publicly air out that yeah, this one really sucked. Um, this is an opportunity to say something about storylines. I really don't see myself as running storylines. I really don't. My theory when it comes to storytelling is not to create storylines because that's really a holdover from the ideas that surround telling stories from an author standpoint. That you need to have a beginning, first act, a second act, and a third act leading to a climax. When in a game like ours that's running 24/7 and is made up of so many people, that structure really fails. And it doesn't feel very natural. And you start having this urge you have to have some big conclusion. You have to have some sort of Buffy fights the main bad sort of conclusion to every single story. And that really doesn't work. It doesn't work with the tone of Vampire. It doesn't work with the kind of game we run. And it's very frustrating to an ST because planning for that kind of climax involves either dictating or expecting a lot of very particular actions from the players. So I try not to think in terms of that. I think in terms of having individuals and events show up and having the world react to what players are doing based on things that have already been set out or just things I make up in order to engage the players. I was just saying the other day that when you are a storyteller, it is often better to push back instead of push. Because if you're pushing back, you are reacting to what players are doing and thus encouraging players to do things. And when I say push back, that's very different from hitting back, which is that's punishing a player for doing things. So I try to create a scenario in my mind and a situation in the city, and based on what players do, have powers that be or forces come into play that react to what they're doing and work against them, work for them, work indifferently, and have their own agendas. And this usually creates engaging plot lines. Whenever we get into a storyline mentality with a climax and all that, it tends to be a step in the wrong direction. The biggest weakness of a Camarilla chronicle compared to a Sabbat chronicle is that it is far less rigid, which is also one of its strengths. And what I mean by rigid is that it is more formless. People have to make their own fun a lot more. The Sabbat, for all its protestations of freedom, has a strict hierarchy. It automatically forms groups of players who operate under a command structure. And it automatically forms relationships between various characters, which is one of the things I like about Sabbat Chronicles, is that everyone has a place in one, almost automatically, regardless of their background. So that's one of the strengths of a Sabbat Chronicle, that a Camarilla Chronicle you're a citizen of a society, but you're not necessarily part of a group. So you have to rely on the players to create a lot more of the tension and fun. While the Sabbat are in a position of antagonism with the world, the Camarilla chronicle is about trying to live in harmony with it. So there's a lot more advanced concepts going on there. Also, the politics is more complicated, more Byzantine, so it's harder to get people into politics at the ground floor. And the rigid hierarchy of age in the Camarilla makes it so that you can't, if you have a neonate character who the player is really good and there's a lot of respect for that character, nonetheless the world demands that that character really can't rise if he's a 5-year-old vampire to be prince. Maybe Primogen, but even that's pushing it. The greatest strength of a Camarilla Chronicle is that it has a lot more allowance to it. It's a lot easier to start playing in one. You can take pretty much any vampire concept that isn't a raging psychopath off the shelf and play it in Vampire the Masquerade and a Camarilla Chronicle because there's not as much of an expectation of what your character should be like in a Sabbat Chronicle. And you can kind of pick up the details as you go along. With a Sabbat game, you need to know what the Sabbat are about and what's expected of you and how these things work and what the background is to really get what's going on with the Sabbat, because everything is so centered around the jihad and their religion and all those other sorts of things, which don't necessarily come natural from the vampire myths that people tell each other in the vampire stories. Other than like John Carpenter's vampires and various movies where the vampires are antagonists and are not very well characterized, where they're the monster in the dark. The types of stories where vampires are the main characters, usually those characters fit very much more into a Camarilla model. So you can make a lot of different kinds of characters in a Camarilla Chronicle as opposed to a Sabbat Chronicle. There's a lot less limits on it. And I think that's why Sabbat Chronicles tend to be very, very good for very short periods of time, but Camarilla Chronicles tend to have more longevity to them. You can do more with them. There's a lot more nuance that you can do with them, even though there's less structure. I'm going to rephrase this question because I'm never going to give any substantial amount of money to Justin Achille unless he offers to resign if I give him a whole bunch of money. So I'll rephrase this as, if I lead a bloody coup and take over White Wolf, what character would I add? And what archetype would I put in? And the archetype I would honestly put in is I would put in a character who was a normal, white-bread, middle-class American, probably Bruja, rather normal stats, a good spread of skills, and something playable, but not keyed toward anything in particular. And I would write him as somebody, probably Bruja, who was trying to deal from the perspective of a normal person with the realities of his existence. Make him a guy that still has to pay rent. And make him a guy who still wonders if his girlfriend is still out there. And who is both not in denial about his vampiric nature in some sort of emo way, but is trying to deal in a very human way with what's going on and the absurdity of it and the pain of it. Because I think that's really what's missing from a lot of vampire template characters, is that they try to be flashy and try to have some sort of gimmick. And it would be interesting to see a treatment and a returning character who was more of a witness and a voice for the average person rather than being a power fantasy. There's a difference between being stuck in the past and being stuck in a rut. A character can be locked into the mentality of the time they were raised in without being immutable. And in fact, the state of them being locked in the past can provoke great changes in character as they come to terms with the fact the world is changing. You might have a character who realizes the world is changing around him and resists it because he is so tied to his past. Or you could have someone struggle with trying to meld together their natural impulses from the time period they were given and the demands of this new world. So just because someone is stuck in the past and static in that meaning doesn't mean that the character has to be unchanging. And I think that's what the book is really talking about, is the fact that older vampires have a problem dealing with the modern world because it is so different than what they grew up with. So you need to keep in mind you might have a character who's a 19th century nobleman, but he still has things happening to him. He still has victories and defeats and problems and emotions. He would approach them from the position of a 19th century nobleman, but he would still change in that context. In the same way that if you had a story set in the 19th century, you would have a character who never stopped being a nobleman, but still could change as he is provoked to. Thanks for all your questions. Please post more. And also I'll be posting a special video very soon just to cover the neonates are awesome question, covering both neonates and Unselai and why you should be interested in playing either.